Hi, everyone, and welcome to Mergers and Acquisitions, a podcast from the Society of Economic Anthropology. My name is Aneil Tripathy, and I'm an economic anthropologist whose research centers on climate finance and how financiers perceive climate change in the environment. So I'm very excited today to chat with Vernon Scarborough, a distinguished university research professor and Charles Phelps Taft Professor in Anthropology at the University of Cincinnati. Vern is the author of What Ancient Landscapes Contribute to Climate Change for Economic Anthropology's symposium issue on climate change. Now, as an anthropologist and archaeologist, Vern has a wealth of knowledge on hydrology and water management, primarily drawn from fieldwork at pre-Columbian Maya civilization sites in the lowlands of Guatemala and Belize, but he has also worked on sites around the world as well. Vern has written extensively on settlement structure and urban change in response to environments and environmental changes, and his research has been published in Nature and a number of top anthropology and scientific publications. And Vern has also been involved in a number of international associations and efforts to make sense of historical human and environment entanglements and what this means for our future in a changing climate. So Vern, as Mergers and Acquisitions is a podcast for the Society of Economic Anthropology, my first question shouldn't be too much of a surprise. What does economic anthropology mean to you?
Well, at the outset, I want to thank you, Aneil, for taking the time to include me in this podcast. Economic anthropology is clearly a diverse field. To me, it's just how society and humans make a living and the complexities associated with that. And it runs the gamut from social justice to mundane material culture. It's all encompassing. And as a consequence, I think archaeology, which of course is my disciplinary affiliation, it makes a lot of sense to work within its umbrella or under its umbrella. Just quickly, that's how I see its role with respect to what I do.
And with this particular focus in economic anthropology, how do you think it can contribute for our efforts to understand and respond to climate change?
Well, archaeology is a discipline that seldom has the opportunity to interact with living populations. We can, and many times we draw upon the ethnographic and ethnohistoric record to make sense out of our material remains, but many times we don't have that opportunity. So what archaeology does do well is really cultivate strong understandings of ecological settings and environments, many times during and prior to human occupation. That may be its strongest lever in communicating in many ways with, quote, the hard sciences, the ones that identify the history of glacial formation and its disappearance, climate change at those macro levels that have occurred on this planet for millennia. There we have a voice in that not only do we interact and to a degree understand the environment, but we bring to it our social skills as anthropologists. Of course, archaeology is under that umbrella as well, to try to make sense out of how humans have acted and reacted to those environmental variations.
Yeah, that's a great link in my mind in terms of being able to be a part of those, in a sense, material and scientific conversations. I know in my work as an economic anthropologist studying financiers in the present moment, it's been fascinating to see how reports on climate change from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and all of these assessments then enter into policy and investment conversations and decision-making in the present. So I think that's wonderful with your archaeological insights. You're able to bring this reflection on past human behavior, as well as in conversation with our understanding in anthropology of social dynamics into kind of these climate change conversations.
That's right. That's right. I think archaeology's strength. Many times we have, I think, been kind of pigeonholed as ivory tower-ish, if you will. Interesting. Everybody's curious about the past, no question about it. But how do you make linkages to the here and now? And of course, it's so imperative and so urgent that we're all at the table discussing these issues about our future. And I think archaeology brings somewhat unique perspective into the fold because of our ability, as I've offered, to see the ecological relationships in concert with what humans have left behind. And I think that is really important, even though it's pretty clear, that today's world is different than a century and then hundreds of centuries, millennia in the past, with population spiking now like it never has before, and with technologies being so incredibly sophisticated. And sometimes those elements turn off or prevent maybe a broader understanding of where archaeology can fit today, because we do have a different data set that's what affected by the fact that populations weren't as large and to a degree as complex, and technologies weren't as complicated in the past. But still, we're sentient beings for the last 50,000 years, and we're trying to solve problems in those environmental settings. And I think lessons can be learned, not to be too pedantic about it.
Oh, completely. And I think that brings up two key points in my mind. One, as you mentioned, that we have to grapple with, in a sense, this changing data set and these changing environmental conditions, population conditions, the urban structures of today, and find ways to compare that and think about that in relation to what has occurred in the past. And also something that's very much at the forefront of my mind in my research in the contemporary moment is how contested ideas of sustainability, ideas of what constitutes useful infrastructure in relation to climate change are. And so it'd be great to hear your thoughts in terms of how, because I know you've grappled with this as well, in terms of thinking about what does sustainability mean, and how do we understand urban, environmental, material engagements of past peoples, and figuring out perhaps what the intention was in these engagements, or perhaps how do we make sense of these entanglements beyond intentionality as well, and then bring that into the complexity, the debates around climate change today.
Those are, fundamental questions, I think for many disciplines, but again, archaeology, given that's my game, I would suggest that, sustainability has at least two vectors, if you will, more probably. And what we're going to do in the future with climate change being maybe the most existential threat. And the pandemic, I think, in many ways, is a extension of what we face. I mean, that is an eye-opener, I think, in reflections that we are going to have to deal with in the future. It's not necessarily climate can't be seen as a causality necessarily, but it's certainly a factor in why we have a pandemic. But there is the notion of mitigation of human behavior, and that's everything from cap and trade and on you go, building seawalls higher than they have been in the past to prevent sea level rise, problems with salinization and such. And those are immediate concerns, and humans have been working in that context for generations, no question about it. In the past, we have some more, quote, green adaptations to mitigate climate change or even seasonal variations in rainfall or absence thereof. The other side of it, I think, is what you could refer to as just an adaptation, using it in the sense that we make clear behavioral changes in how we interact with one another and the planet on a broader level. And I see adaptations almost being more important than mitigation at this point. I mean, we have to mitigate, there's no question about it. Miami is going to be underwater soon, and several other, principal cities, Venice, if you look at St. Mark's and the plaza in front of it, is you have to backstroke to pray, so yeah. That's not so great. And even with the dikes and the complicated arrangements that they've made in the embayment there, it's still flooding, so we'll just see where that goes. But the sustainability question, again, with regard to, I would say, the true resilience and true adaptability, gets us into changes that we're going to have to make on this planet, because the tipping point, probably is past. I mean, we can slow climate change, but it's well on its way. I mean, the hurricanes, the forest fires, the sea level rise, all these things are happening now, and they're not going to be abated for some time. It's going to affect us. We can slow it, perhaps. But the question is then, what are other environments in the past that have lived with such realities done to accommodate their futures from the past, of course? And I've spent a fair amount of time, because of the Maya research you mentioned at the outset, but also looking at Southeast Asia, and particularly Angkor, the great Khmer city and empire in present-day Cambodia, a city probably the largest in the 12th century on the globe. People don't really reflect on that. This is a subtropical city. And there are other parts of the world where we have great civilizations and urban adaptations, like Sri Lanka, West Africa, even Amazonia, though it's hard to argue they were cities, but there's certainly complicated social orders there prior to the colonial embrace from the West. In those settings, one thing you find that urban occupation, is quite dispersed. It's low density. And there's reasons for that. In part, it's difficult to make a living in these settings, perhaps more so than more arid settings, I would say, in part because technology can be employed rather quickly with moving water in arid settings from Tigris Euphrates or the Nile or the Indus, Yangtze, all those great semi-arid civilizations, which were primary civilizations. That is, they were some of the first we know on the globe in the old world. They were able to nucleate. They were able to store food for long periods of time because of the lack of humidity and the control they could put on pests to a degree. So storage was a much easier experiment. And of course, when you can do that, you can concentrate resources, you can feed more people. Your urban definition can be much more nucleated because humans are clearly social animals, and we prefer that in many ways, if the primates are any reflection. But what about these tropical settings? It turns out, the greatest diversity in the globe, associated with many of these settings. We respect that in the Amazon or the Congo Basin today, and of course, prior to that, Southeast Asia. These were wonderfully rich environments, and some places they still continue to be, but changed markedly with I think, the role of capitalism, and we've all kind of homogenized a definition of what urbanism is and what economy is. These subtropical settings, although probably colonized quite a bit later, because it is difficult to make a living in those settings, maybe more so, as I say, than other settings, because of turnover rates, if you will. And what I'm getting there is the great diversity I mentioned, but in any one patch or microenvironment in those settings, the appearance of any one species is very low. That is, the numbers are very low. So you might have, in Central America, you might have one mahogany here, and several hundred meters away, another, or at least 100 meters away. Same thing with the jaguar. It's got its mate clearly several kilometers away. So that dispersion of any one species makes it hard to make a living. And when humans cultivate those areas or colonize those areas, that's the reality. And so you do disperse. And disease can run rampant when you live really tooth and jowl. The organic rates of decomposition are extremely high. You have a warmer temperature, you have a humid setting, rainfall is high, generally speaking, in subtropics. All these things, in temperatures, of course, all those things produce a richness of organic life. It's just sort of organically heaving, alive. But as a consequence, it's very difficult to count on a particular species, particularly when they're dispersed like that, to make a living. Domestication occurs, clearly, and we have plants and animals that do that, most well reported in the more arid settings, semi-arid settings. And there's reasons for that, because temperate and particularly more semi-arid settings tend to have herd animals, right? You tend to have vast fields of wild grasses, and that's great for domestication. I mean, that's where our oats and wheat and barley and rye, they all come from that. Right. And people can experiment as a result of having so many grasses to play with. And the weeds themselves, which we think oats and rye probably were, they're picking out, they begin to morph if they are genetically pre-adapted to another domesticated crop. So you get richness. And then again, you've got goats and pigs and sheep and cattle. All that's happening, in those settings. In the tropics, that's never an option. You don't have that opportunity. So concentrating resources and keeping them organically available is a major problem. The upside in that is that you are dispersed. And we do have situations now recorded in the Maya area, site like Tikal, which was this grand center, about the time of Christ to maybe 800 AD. And then the same is true in the Old World Angkor and in Jinizhou in West Africa. There are several sites across the globe that we've put our finger on that have this different kind of settlement pattern. They're very dispersed. They're huge sometimes. I said Angkor at the outset probably had 750,000 people in its radius, right? And it was a size, just if you want to put it in context, for those of you that, certainly Neil, you understand the Beltline area that encompasses DC, Washington, DC, would be the perimeter of the city. So when you start working it out, the population density is closer to 700, maybe to 1,000 people per square kilometer, versus a place like Uruk, which is one of the first cities we have on the globe, and its many antecedents, Kish, Lagash, all these sites along the Tigris-Euphrates that were considered very early, probably the earliest experiments in urbanism, their density is a full magnitude greater than it is in these other tropical settings. Whenever a tropical city occurs prior to the Western embrace and the elevation technologies that now make it possible to live very close together in tropical settings at a high expense, but we're willing to pay that for the return we get on our investments. But in the past, it was never a possibility in these tropical settings. Well, what's that? That's an interesting model then that we might want to reflect on, particularly as the world is changing so rapidly and climate change is making the global south move north in many ways, right? What kinds of models coming out of those settings might be appropriate in our new world? The context, in part, is today, the sea level rise will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1, maybe even 2 meters, but let's say 1 meter by 2100. Probably more, actually, closer to maybe 2. We don't know, of course. These are projections. With that, we know, too, that right now, about 75% of the population will be occupying urban settings if the trajectory is projected again, for the future. There are about 35, maybe 30, 35 megacities on the planet. 3/4 of those, megacity being 10 million or more, there's 35 of them maybe on the globe, but thereabouts, but 3/4 of them are in coastlines. So what's going to happen to those populations? There's going to be displacement for sure, right? Agricultural lands will be salinized from just seawater encroachment. You'll have infrastructure suffering as a consequence of just the corrosive effects of seawater moving into steel and metal infrastructure. That's the future. So when you displace people, what's the best way to do that? Well, you just set up a community and concentrate and use the same model, or is there an opportunity now, drawing from this ancient model of dispersion? Well, maybe you put people, or you obviously it has to be negotiation with all these communities, right? And their cultural orientations have to be incorporated. But if they have to move, where do they go? Well, the hinterlands, to begin with, are where most of our resources lie anyway, right? And to empower the disenfranchised that we associate with ruralism, if you will, already, and not the urban setting, if we were able to disperse them in those settings, where today, well over 7 billion cell phones are on the planet. People can work at home, in a way that they hadn't in the past. Plus infrastructure, right? Now, if we had light rail improved, we could take trunk highways that presently exist and just make them dendritic. There's ways of improving our harvesting of human resources, to say nothing of our material needs, from the sectors out there, and give these people, empower people in the hinterlands to interact with urban nodes. Not that cities are going away. No, I don't think that's highly unlikely, but they can be recast. And maybe again, this dispersed model that we find in these tropical settings from the past might be interesting to revisit. It's not a one-to-one, no question about it. Things have changed radically. But is there something invested in that, particularly with wind and solar and hopefully the future of batteries, right? These areas would become rich zones for economic improvement and resilience in wake of what might even be viewed as an opportunity of redefining city. Now, today, many of your planners, Florida, Glasser, others that deal with, basically the definition of urbanism, are wedded to the idea of something they refer to as, I've almost forgotten, the creative citizen, or the how does it go? There's a catch anyway, a term. The creative citizen is one that interacts with a lot of other people immediately because of the fact that people are tooth and jowl. ideas are generated, quickly in those settings. There's no doubt about it. And that's really healthy. I don't deny that. However, with these new technological interactions, people working at home, like we're interacting now, it's a different kind of communication network, right? And we can communicate rapidly anyway, and we can be
Exactly.
anywhere to do this, right? So that element of the urban creative citizen is somewhat muted as a consequence of the blessings of technology. It's just how we employ technology to best assert this new reality. And I think a dispersed arrangement is not a bad idea. And some would say it's really important with things like pandemics raging. And this may be not a unique situation, these pandemics, in the future, because there's so many of us and we're so tooth and jowl with a natural world that is being so disrupted, and these things cross over. And they have I think it's accelerated, in the last 40 years or so, everything from AIDS to this, what we're suffering through, in a way that may be, again, another wake-up call. So again, there's many things that could be employed and thought, invested in this new ecology, if you will, where humans are not anyway disconnected. We are of the natural world. And I think one of the things that's happened in some quarters with capitalism is that we've lost sight of the importance of that natural world, that somehow the natural world is free. You can exploit it with abandon, and nothing is really going to be charged at the other end. And of course, when you look at an open pit mine somewhere in Indonesia or Montana, or if you look at coal mining where people are just blowing up the tops of mountains to mine them, you have to figure out what the ecological damage that occurs and what its price on the humans in that zone over a period of time. So all these things are wedded, and it is a set of wicked problems that need addressing. But I think archaeology and anthropology is positioned within the subset of economic anthropology to help address these things.
That was a wonderful reflection. And, as you mentioned, really highlights well the value of a kind of economic anthropology perspective where you're thinking about focusing on the human experience, what can promote well-being, and how is that connected to certain material ways of living and certain models. So as you laid out the value of a dispersed settlement model in opposition to and kind of as an alternative to this intense centralization that both urban planners seem to be supporting in our society, as well as the kind of structure of capital accumulation, particularly our financial system, which is so wedded in building very dense urban centers. When we go to these megacities, right, there's usually around some sort of a financial center, and the property values are all focused on people living in very close proximity. The values in Boston, New York City are much higher than in Montana, in Indiana. And so we have this financial system of value that seems to be really limiting our possibilities that could really give us much better options for living. And we learned that from the archaeological record, from thinking about things with a kind of perspective from economic anthropology. I loved your reflection. It made me think a lot about my current position right now. I am usually based in Massachusetts, outside of Boston, but with the ability to work remotely, access to Zoom recordings, and all of these types of digital material infrastructures, I've been able to come down to Atlanta, Georgia, where it is both warmer and much less dense, which is an interesting thing because urban planners always seem to compare Atlanta negatively to cities such as Barcelona, saying that there's much more energy efficiency because it's denser. And for sure, there's some benefits that we get from density, but as you so clearly laid out, there are a lot of benefits that we get from dispersion as well. And being here in Atlanta, I'm surrounded by trees, open space, the buildings aren't right next to each other. And for sure, there are forms of infrastructure that should be probably transformed. The heavily reliant transportation system on single cars that are gasoline-based currently. But there's a lot of potential here and a lot of things that are valuable. And with initiatives such as the Beltline here in Atlanta, they're trying to build another type of transport infrastructure that could also support some of the sustainability interventions that we're discussing.
Really true, and I think these urban settings, they take a real psychological toll on people too. I mean, you think of the spike in crime, elements of poverty, just those two alone, are so deranging for populations. And I think if you spread out and give people a degree of well-being, as you've put it, by virtue of having a job, a reflection, using resources that are out there, it's a different equation. And I think the future could be really hopeful with this menacing climate change if we're clever. But again, it's going to take a lot of thought. Displacing people is no joke. Jane Jacobs, who really was fundamental, arguing you really don't want to change communities drastically. Leave the community store in place. It's a place that's important for your subset in your urban setting, unites people, post offices, all those things are, have to kind of come with a relocation, right? And ethnicity issues, all those have to be evaluated. But I do think there'll become a time, particularly in those really large megacities, even smaller ones that are coastally positioned or affected by strange climatic conditions in the interior, forest fires, whatever. It's going to be tricky. The future is going to be tricky. In terms of inequality, it's something I've thought a little bit about in these various settings as well. It's true in subtropical settings, the role of these, we can call them turnovers, ecological turnovers, is, some have suggested, are basically predictably unpredictable. And that's tough on projecting futures when you have that situation. I know you're familiar with the economist Piketty, and his, I think one thing is one of the fascinating things that comes out of that work is, from my vantage point, that inheritable wealth that is passed on generation after generation works best for that 1% if it's pretty much uninterrupted. That is, if you don't have a lot of serious changes in the social and, to a degree, the physical environment, so that it just begins to be passed on generation after generation. And then you end up with some very wealthy people, but many times at the cost of everybody else. And it's the situations where you have disruptions that you kind of recalculate, in a sense. And I think he makes the case that, World War I and World War II were moments like that, where you had to have a recalculation. And the standard of living was much, much more equitable during and after those periods, major disruptions in resources and who got what. And I was thinking a while back, well, maybe that is what, again, these environmental disruptions in settings like subtropics, where it's so hard to make a living, right, accommodate, kind of ironically, a greater equity. And again, it's sometimes difficult to internalize in the archaeological record when you go into a site like the Maya area, where you see these spectacular murals where these elites are dressed in incredible costumes and throwing their weight around, and they're highly influential, and they release their own mind, but a lot of it's propaganda. And you see the same thing in Angkor. I mean, they're wonderful structures, very elaborate, complicated, and again, these scenes that suggest great wealth and opulence. And you think, well, there's a disconnect here, Scarborough, given what you just said about equity, right? But it may very well be that the turnover rate for those elites and why they do what they do is something that the biologists call costly signaling. It's a cost associated with doing that, to try to obtain resources and be richer. But it's thin. It's like a potlatch almost. You have these spectacular displays, right? But they are very expensive. And within that realm, they are competing. It's a status rivalry thing. And that the rank and file is sort of not even seeing it. I mean, it's, they're in a different realm, and they are trying to make a living. They have certain social norms and ways of dealing, worldviews, if you will, that ally them with their neighbors. And as long the kings and queens can do what they care to do, but there may be, in this situation, unlike, say, Western Europe and its history, and other more temperate settings, I would say, there may very well be a sense of well-being that's embedded at those lower echelons in a situation, even with the irony of these kings and queens, because like the environment, there is a high turnover in those kings and queens. So again, that notion of turnover is expedited and accelerated both socially and environmentally in these tropical settings, which, again, going back to Piketty, would suggest that we have a situation where it's very difficult to amass wealth, heritable wealth, to the next generation. It's constantly being affected. And as a result, then there is more for others. Anyway, that is one thought to keep in mind with respect to what archaeology, this kind of mundane subdivision of anthropology, can actually assist, perhaps, at least in a discussion. I mean, I'm not saying I'm right, I'm just reflecting. These are all takes that I think we have to keep in mind, because equity, clearly, as we move into our new world in the next 100 years, is going to be really important. I mean, that's the whole Black Lives Matter so immediate right now.
No, completely. And I think those are great points in terms of thinking about how our past reflections and the possible signs of elite behavior in the past that created a rigidity of material consumption could highlight and give us ways to reflect on our current situation, right? Where we have very wealthy individuals and groups of people connected with the fossil fuel industry that seem really focused on trying to continue the values associated and the social standing that they have from that material industry, even while it continues to create such clear devastation in relation to our environmental well-being. Definitely, it's great to think about what are the possibilities opened by perhaps this uncertainty that climate change brings to us, and how clearly there are going to be quite a few, many devastating effects. But what are the possibilities and ways that we can maybe navigate or figure out strategies to deal with this uncertainty, which could ultimately support a more equal society, a more equitable society, and transformation of social structure, perhaps in a way that is more both socially and environmentally sustainable.
Absolutely. So much is embedded in the notion of trust, as you know, as an economist. I mean, that is the kind of the bottom line in a lot of this. And getting our leaders to project that profile would really be nice. Obviously, in the examples I just used, there wasn't a lot of trust in a sense. However, there was a certain pervasive worldview that held things together. I mean, if you did certain things for the deities, and many times it was believed that the kings and queens had, some kind of conduit to the deities, and ideology was many times more homogenous, I think. I mean, people believe. And in our world, given the role of technology and capitalism, I mean, we are highly skeptical, and maybe more so now than ever, of our leadership and of the world around us generally. And that has to somehow be ameliorated, dealt with, because trust, I think, allows the economic underpinnings, the social well-being of a group to propagate and be enriched over time. And that's just really tough right now. I'm not sure how this transition will unfold globally in the next 100 years. I mean, that's kind of the framework I think archaeologists think in, just what will unfold. I don't know for sure, but I do think thoughtful reflection from a broad audience. I've often thought when we sit down at the table, it can't just be politicians and those from the industry that make these decisions. I think it's got to be a broad-based coalition that would include everything from priests to programmers to poets. We need the humanities heavily involved in all this too, right? I mean, they've been thinking about well-being for a long time and how you define it. So it's got to be a bigger family, I think. And we really haven't, I don't think, been there, in part because some of us can be more dismissive of other ways of thinking. And that's probably not all that healthy given how uncertain times are.
And I think that's a great segue for a topic I really wanted to discuss with you. In starting this podcast, Mergers and Acquisitions, a couple of us at the Society for Economic Anthropology were really interested in how both do we create a medium, right, which we can, in a sense, disperse to a wider audience than perhaps some academic publications have, but also how do we encourage and foster conversation across disciplines, similarly to what you're saying in terms of what we need for our collective decision making, not just having financiers and policymakers and politicians, but bringing in folks in the humanities from different disciplines, engineers to the table. And so I'd be very interested to hear how you've navigated through your career to both kind of establish yourself as an anthropologist, as an archaeologist, but also one thing that I really find inspiring from your work is this potential to build connections across disciplines and into different forms of international collaborations.
Well, I must say it's tricky, it is. And you kind of have to find kindred spirits in a sense that may have a very different disciplinary focus and background, but that are interested, in the really big picture and not, I mean, some of the most brilliant researchers around aren't much interested in anything else but their own work, right? And so you have to kind of negotiate and navigate around those folks, find their student or whomever that might be able to address really complex issues within that maybe narrow band, but are absolutely necessary for a greater understanding of the past, in my case, for the most part. One way, I mean, this is sort of, again, tongue in cheek, literally, humor. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things I really admire in a researcher or a friend or a family member is humor. And it breaks down all kinds of bonds, that in terms of what you may have anticipated or want to do. But that ability or that interest in laughing hard, always respectful. I mean, we're not, I'm not saying, anything but I do think humor is such an important element in defining in part those connectivities and linkages, but intelligence. I remember reading something by the anthropologist Homer Barnett called a book he wrote called Innovation. And he was assessing intelligence just globally. And one thing he said, the one thing you can, because it's so hard to measure such crazy things, IQ tests really are ridiculous from my vantage point, but the ability to produce a bit of a statement, basically, that seems somehow counterintuitive and sparks this notion of laughter, right? Building upon what is irony and unclear, but because of the twists of language and the situation, you end up with something else. That's a marked reflection of intelligence, right? That, for me, is a door into working with an engineer or with a physicist. It's a comfort level then that allows other doors to open to solve real world problems. That probably will have to be excised from this.
No, that was a great response. It reminds me a lot, and I think that's a great example of, in a sense, another category of human interaction, which has been very much identified in the humanities, in the social sciences.
Good point.
Realizing its value. One of my close colleagues, Daniel Stalele, is at Copenhagen Business School, who is also very active in the Society for Economic Anthropology. He has an article looking at humor amongst private equity analysts, actually, and looking at how it allows them to kind of grapple with and talk about social inequality. So it's great to be able to think about that category and see how it's such a kind of key element, right? In terms of, particularly, I think, when you're trying to do something new in society,
yes,
or something that is slightly taboo, or kind of not really clearly open in our society. When you try to create new ground, I think humor is a key.
Very well put, Neil. Yes, I agree. Yeah, no, it's really an important program that you're involved with. I think these podcasts, I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to try to address them. Otherwise, it's really great to know you, and I hope we can stay in contact.
Oh, likewise. It's been a great discussion. I guess one maybe final point would be, I guess, how do you think the way that you've understood economic anthropology has perhaps changed, over your whole career, or has it stayed the same?
Well, I think the role of climate change, I mean, I've always been interested in questions about water hydrology, how that impacts humans, the most precious of all resources, even more so than food, those kinds of arguments have drawn me, to a sustainability end rather. But in the last decade or so, maybe more, with climate change, more and more apparent its impact for the future, more and more so, I think that has occupied a good deal of my thinking, and the notion of sustainability in that context and how we can treat these wicked problems. I'm sorry, could you repeat your question again? I'm not sure I'm addressing.
No, I think you are. I mean, basically, in terms of how you've understood economic anthropology as kind of a focus throughout your career, but it sounds to me the kind of the focus, or the way the kind of value of it has changed really in response to the kind of the growing impacts in our understanding of climate change.
I think that's true. Yeah, I think that's true. Now, again, archaeologists have been in that world for a long time because, again, we don't necessarily have a record that we can articulate with living human beings, and within generations, of course, but when you talk about hundreds of years, it's not really accessible. So archaeology becomes the way to approach that. And these are the kinds of slow moving changes that are not even perceptible sometimes within a generation. And archaeology kind of sees beyond that. And climate change is of that ilk. Either it's going to get much worse or slow down a bit. I don't think we're going to ever be quite what we were, say, 50 to 100 years ago. So we really do want to draw from this ancient past. But archaeology have been looking at these things for millennia. That's what we kind of do. So,
and kind of on that line, one final point also, how do you think about these new conceptualizations, right, that have been really key, I think, in the humanities and the social sciences with thinking about climate change, kind of drawing from geology in terms of reframing this period as the Anthropocene? How does your kind of role as an archaeologist and as kind of someone who's very immersed in our kind of historical record think about these reimaginations of the current moment, our recent past, and the possibilities, as well as perhaps the things we should be aware of or kind of take a step back to think about when we have these big labels such as the Anthropocene?
Well, it's funny. I don't get too embroiled in that, in part because whether you define the Anthropocene with, let's refer to it as a Holocene geographically, which drives the geologists crazy because they're looking for something called a golden spike. What on the landscape can we identify in a stratigraphic profile that indicates that humans are really making a huge difference, right? And many of the geologists say, well, it didn't happen until industrial revolution. So a couple hundred years ago, maybe we can begin to see these things. Others say, no, it's only when we begin to see radioactive materials, from bomb experiments, that sort of thing, in the last maybe 50 years or whatever it's been in the record. That's when Anthropocene begins. Archaeologists would say, at least, 5,000 years ago, when the appearance of early cities, appears on the globe, right? I think we're dealing with a different kind of reality. From my vantage point, there are probably three, and this is a distillation, three moments in human history, when things really change markedly, and it accelerates. I think first when we're basically evolved to the point where we have big brains and we're bipedal and we're dexterous with our hands and make tools and all that. So that may go back, I don't know, several million years ago. Okay, and then the next big one is agriculture. Big deal, about 10,000 years ago. So really relatively recently, given that kind of trajectory, with the same large brains. At that point, we were as sentient as we are today. There's no real difference between those early agriculturalists and us today. And then within 5,000 years, given that trajectory, it's really accelerating. We have the first experiments in urbanism, right? And I think my take, when urbanism hits the global world, or when it's initiated in our world, it's a game changer, right? People coming together in those kinds of concentrations, whether it's dispersed, as with, I mentioned, the Maya or Angkor in Cambodia, or the even older semi-arid settings along the Tigris-Euphrates and elsewhere, where there are great rivers in the old world. It's a game changer in how we organize space and organize one another. And that's where you begin to get this notion of inequality beginning to raise its ugly head, right? And control over others in a different way. And that then leads into who we are today in so many ways. And the question, I think, is what is the next breakthrough? We moved from agriculturalists to urbanists within 5,000 years, right? And, we are set for another major breakthrough. Something's going to happen here. What it might be is still unclear, but it may be that I've often thought maybe the better way of dealing with the future isn't a nation state, which is what we kind of defer to now, but maybe it's going back to some kind of notion of city state, where large cities organize differently, given the models I've proposed and others have proposed, but that the communities around them begin to interface in an orbit that defines territory and resources differently. And it may be that there's more trust, more communication, if between your hinterland and your urban setting, and its lack of divisioning. It's not the core periphery divisioning. They are sort of one of the same, but the whole city state is defined in a way that the nation state isn't, and may be actually more able to react and interact quickly to problems and communicate with next city state. It may just be a different kind of network that begins to unfold. Whereas now we have these nation states that are somehow many times disconnected from their constituencies in a way that may be something akin to a city state, still with scale, but a different kind of trust and interaction. Again, this is the kind of fun you can have in thinking these things through. As you've mentioned, that ability to work with humanists, social scientists, hardcore scientists, if you will, more maybe. That's. I don't mean to be less enthusiastic about science, because I am. I feel like I am a scientist, right? That's what I support. But these other elements, other divisions, are important too. That's all.
Completely, and I think that really shows the value of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary collaborations, and I think which begins, in economic anthropology, our subdiscipline begins as a intersection, right,
Yes.
of scholarly interests, and it's a really fertile ground. I think, thank you so much for joining us today, Vern, because I think we've covered so many really key topics in terms of how really economic anthropology, archaeology can get us to think about climate change, open up new possibilities for human settlement, for our existence, and ways that we can interact with the material world around us, which both us and it are constantly in flux, as we've seen through the historical record.
Well, again, thanks a lot for your time, Aneil. And this is I think, great way of reporting information and hopefully influencing a few others. That'd be great.